Your Honor, Miss Wilson is broke. She cannot provide a stable home. A child deserves security, and security is not in her possession. The words sliced through family court like a verdict delivered before any evidence was heard. My ex-husband's lawyer stood with practiced confidence, his expensive suit and Harvard law ring catching the harsh fluorescent lighting that made everything in that courtroom look sickly and desperate. Behind him, Richard's family filled the front row like a tribunal of wealth and judgment. His mother's pearls caught the light as she whispered loudly enough for the judge to hear. "The boy belongs with us. She has nothing to offer." Their laughter rippled through that sterile room, soft, cultivated chuckles that carried the casual cruelty of people who'd never doubted their right to take whatever they wanted, including my 7-year-old son. But as I sat perfectly still in my discount blazer, hands folded to hide their trembling, I felt the weight of the manila envelope in my briefcase. Evidence they never knew existed. Documents that would transform their comfortable assumptions into catastrophic miscalculations. Let them laugh. They hadn't seen what was about to end their laughter forever. My name is Hazel Wilson. I'm 36 years old, and to them, I was nothing more than the struggling ex-wife who'd made the mistake of thinking love could survive in a world where money talks louder than vows. But they never saw what I carried beneath the silence, what I'd been building in the shadows while they dismissed me as a failure whose only achievement was becoming inconvenient. The kitchen table in my studio apartment told the story better than any legal document. Bills spread across its surface like battle plans, rent notices, utility warnings, medical copays for my son Danny's asthma treatments that insurance deemed non-essential. Each envelope represented another calculation, another choice between groceries and gas, between pride and survival. I worked nights cleaning office buildings in downtown Hartford, pushing industrial vacuums across marble floors that cost more per square foot than I made in a month. The work started at 11 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., leaving me just enough time to shower, change into the one professional outfit I owned, and pick up Danny from his babysitter's house before school started. The hardest part wasn't the exhaustion or the ache in my knees from scrubbing conference room floors where decisions got made about budgets larger than my annual salary. The hardest part was packing Danny's lunch in those pre-dawn hours when the world felt suspended between night and morning, knowing that other 7-year-olds went to school with lunchboxes that didn't require their mothers to choose between peanut butter and jelly based on which cost less per ounce. But Danny never complained. He'd sit at our kitchen table doing homework while I counted tips from the cleaning crew supervisor, his small fingers careful with the colored pencils I'd bought at the dollar store. Sometimes he'd look up with those serious brown eyes, his father's eyes, unfortunately, and ask questions that cut deeper than any insult Richard's family had ever delivered. "Mom, why doesn't Daddy come to my soccer games anymore? Why do I have to sleep here when Tommy gets his own room at his dad's house? Are we poor?" Each question was a reminder that the custody battle brewing in family court wasn't just about legal documents and judicial decisions. It was about a 7-year-old boy who was learning that love and money weren't the same currency, but that courts often couldn't tell the difference. The memory that kept me awake during those 4 hours between cleaning shifts and school pickup was from 3 months ago, when Richard had come to collect Danny for his weekend visitation. He'd stood in the doorway of our studio apartment like a tourist slumming in a neighborhood he'd never choose to live in, his designer suit and college fraternity watch announcing wealth with the subtlety of a marching band. "Without me, you're nothing," he'd said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that comes from people who've never had to choose between heat and electricity. "Without my family's money, you can't even keep the lights on." I'd swallowed those words like glass, letting them cut deep enough to leave scars that would remind me exactly what I was fighting against. Not just Richard, but everything he represented. The assumption that financial struggle meant moral failure, that poverty was evidence of unworthiness, that mothers who worked multiple jobs to survive somehow loved their children less than fathers who wrote checks from trust funds they'd never earned. His family had perfected the art of playing aristocrats in a country that pretended not to have an aristocracy. Golf weekends at exclusive clubs where membership cost more than most people's houses. Yacht photos on social media platforms designed to announce success to people desperate to believe wealth was evidence of character. Lawyers on speed dial who specialized in making inconvenient people disappear from family trees like unwelcome branches pruned for aesthetic purposes. To them, I was the intruder who'd dared to want custody of their bloodline, the working-class girl who'd temporarily seduced their son, but had never been intended as permanent fixture in their carefully curated family legacy. They saw Danny not as my child, but as their investment in genetic continuity, their insurance policy against the kind of ordinary life they'd spent generations climbing away from. But what they never understood, what people like them never understand, is that being underestimated can become the most powerful weapon in your arsenal when you're smart enough to use their assumptions against them. While they planned their legal strategy around the assumption that I was too broke to fight back effectively, too uneducated to understand the system they'd mastered, too exhausted from survival to mount serious resistance, I was building something they'd never see coming. Every night after my cleaning shift, I'd sit at that kitchen table surrounded by bills and legal documents, teaching myself family law from library books and online resources that didn't require Harvard degrees or family connections to access. I learned about precedent and procedure, about the difference between what courts said they valued and what they actually rewarded with custody decisions. But more importantly, I learned about evidence, about documentation, about the kinds of proof that could transform assumptions into facts, suspicions into convictions, whispers into testimony that would reshape everything Richard's family thought they knew about who deserved to raise Danny. Even when I wiped away my son's tears at night, tears he cried because other kids had asked why his clothes came from Walmart while his dad wore suits that cost more than our rent, I knew that one day, I'd have to prove that love was stronger than their empire. What they never realized was that I'd been documenting everything, every missed visitation, every broken promise, every moment when their wealth had been prioritized over Danny's well-being, every instance when their idea of parenting had been writing checks instead of showing up. The woman they'd dismissed as too poor to matter was about to demonstrate that some battles aren't won with money. They're won with evidence that money can't buy, testimony that trust funds can't silence, and love that refuses to be purchased by people who've confused having everything with deserving anything. Danny deserved better than parents who saw him as a possession to be owned rather than a person to be cherished. And I was going to make sure he got it, regardless of what that cost me or what it revealed about the people who'd tried to erase me from his story. The mother they'd underestimated was about to remind them that poverty doesn't make you powerless. It just makes you more determined to prove that power comes from places they'd never learned to look. The whispers followed me through every courthouse hallway, every mediation session, every legal consultation where attorneys looked at my thrift store blazer and calculated how much they could charge someone who obviously couldn't afford their usual rates. Hazel can't win this. I'd hear them murmur in elevators that smelled like expensive cologne in desperation. She's broke. She's working nights. Judges always side with stability, and stability means money. They weren't wrong about the math that usually determined custody cases in Connecticut family courts. Richard's family had resources that could stretch legal proceedings until I ran out of savings, energy, or hope. Their attorney was Margaret Chen from Whitman and Associates, the kind of white-shoe law firm where junior partners drove cars that cost more than my annual salary. But mathematics had never been my strongest subject. What I understood was documentation, pattern recognition, and the kind of meticulous record-keeping that comes from managing a household budget where every dollar has to be accounted for twice. The mediation session was held in a conference room that felt designed to intimidate people like me. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Hartford's financial district, leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and a conference table so polished I could see my reflection looking back with the kind of determination that wealth can't buy. Richard sat across from me with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to win, his Harvard Business School ring catching the afternoon light as he drummed his fingers against legal documents that outlined exactly how my poverty would be used against me in court. That's when he leaned close, his voice carrying the same venomous tone I remembered from our divorce proceedings 18 months earlier. "You'll lose, Hazel," he whispered, loud enough for his attorney to hear but quiet enough to sound like concern rather than threat. "Money always wins in these situations. You'll see Danny every other weekend, if you're lucky. Maybe supervised visits if I decide to push for them." His smile was the kind that appears in nightmares, practiced, cold, designed to communicate that resistance was futile because the outcome had already been determined by people with better resources and fewer scruples. But what Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd spent the last 8 months gathering everything. Bank records showing unexplained cash withdrawals that coincided with his business trips to Atlantic City. Casino ledgers obtained through public records requests that documented gambling losses totaling $43,000 in 6 months. Police reports from incidents his family's attorneys had managed to keep out of local newspapers through strategic donations to the Hartford Police Benevolent Association. The real treasure was buried under the non-disclosure agreements his family had paid various people to sign over the years. Restaurant servers who'd been fired for reporting Richard's behavior during client dinners. A babysitter who'd been paid to forget about finding cocaine residue in Danny's bathroom during a weekend visitation. Hotel staff who'd witnessed incidents that wealthy families prefer to resolve with cash rather than criminal charges. Each document had cost me something: hours of research when I should have been sleeping, legal fees I'd paid by working overtime shifts, favors called in from people who understood that sometimes justice requires citizens to do the work that institutions won't do. Above my desk in our studio apartment, I'd taped a yellow sticky note with one line written in black ink: "The day he mocks me in court will be the day I end his legacy." Every night after Danny fell asleep, I'd sit at that same kitchen table where bills got sorted and homework got checked, spreading evidence across its surface, like pieces of a puzzle, that would eventually form a picture too clear to ignore or explain away. My attorney was Sandra Martinez, a public defender who'd taken my case pro bono because she'd recognized something familiar in my situation, the kind of systematic disadvantage that comes when poverty meets privilege in family court, where the presumption of innocence often depends on the quality of suit you can afford to wear. We worked quietly, building our case piece by piece like constructing a house of glass, invisible until the light shone through it in exactly the right way to reveal everything that had been hidden in darkness. Sandra understood that we couldn't compete with Richard's family on resources, so we'd have to outwork them on preparation. While they relied on assumptions about what poverty meant and what judges typically decided in cases like ours, we documented reality with the kind of precision that comes from people who can't afford to be wrong. The beauty of the truth, Sandra told me during one of our late-night strategy sessions, is that it doesn't require expensive presentation. It just requires someone brave enough to speak it clearly when the moment arrives. That moment was approaching faster than any of us had anticipated. Richard's attorney had petitioned for an expedited hearing, confident that a quick resolution would favor their client before I could mount effective resistance. They were betting that I'd cave under pressure, accept unfavorable terms rather than risk losing everything in a trial I supposedly couldn't win. What they hadn't calculated was that I'd already lost everything that mattered when Richard left. Everything except Danny, and the certainty that a mother's love could survive anything that money could buy, including judges who confused financial stability with moral character. The evidence folder had grown thick enough to require rubber bands to keep it closed. Bank statements, police reports, witness affidavits, medical records that told a story about Richard's priorities during the years when he'd been more concerned with maintaining his image than maintaining his responsibilities as a father. But the most damaging evidence wasn't about money or substances, or the kind of destructive behavior that wealthy families typically manage to keep private. The most damaging evidence was about neglect, systematic, documented neglect of a 7-year-old boy whose asthma attacks had sent him to emergency rooms 3 times during weekends, when his father's attention had been focused on activities that didn't include parental supervision. Each hospital visit was documented with times, dates, and medical reports that painted a picture of a child whose life-threatening condition had been treated as an inconvenience by people too wealthy to understand that some problems can't be solved by writing checks. The sticky note above my desk had become prophecy waiting to fulfill itself. Richard had mocked me in mediation, dismissed me in legal filings, and underestimated me in ways that would soon become very expensive mistakes. The woman he tried to erase was about to remind him that mothers don't disappear just because you stop paying attention to them. We multiply, document, and prepare for war. The gavel struck with the finality of thunder, and family court fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights that had witnessed 1,000 custody battles where money talked louder than maternal instinct. Margaret Chen, Richard's attorney, stood at her polished mahogany podium like a prosecutor delivering a verdict rather than making an argument. Her Armani suit and Harvard law confidence filled that courtroom with the kind of authority that comes from never having lost a case to someone wearing a discount blazer from TJ Maxx. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying across marble floors with surgical precision, "custody with Miss Wilson, would be nothing short of reckless. The evidence clearly shows that she lacks the financial stability, the consistent housing, and the support structure necessary to provide Daniel with the secure environment he deserves. Her presentation had been methodical and devastating. Financial records showing my two-job schedule, utility shut-off notices, medical bills that remained unpaid despite payment plan agreements. Each piece of evidence designed to prove that poverty was evidence of unfitness, that struggle was synonymous with failure, that love without money wasn't enough to justify custody of a 7-year-old boy whose trust fund could buy better care than his mother's devotion. The Wilson family has offered Daniel opportunities that Miss Wilson simply cannot match, Chen continued, gesturing toward Richard and his parents with the kind of practice theater that comes from attorneys who understand that family court is partly legal proceeding and partly performance art. Private school education, medical insurance without gaps, a stable home environment where children don't have to worry about whether the electricity will be on when they come home from school. The smirk spread across Richard's family like wildfire. His mother's pearl necklace caught the courtroom lights as she nodded approvingly, her expression carrying the satisfied vindication of someone watching justice align with her assumptions about who deserved what in a world where resources determined rights. Richard's father leaned back in his chair with arms crossed in premature triumph, his Rolex catching light that seemed to announce the inevitable outcome of proceedings where wealth and custody typically went hand in hand like business partners closing profitable deals. Behind them sat a gallery of supporters who'd come to witness what they expected to be a formality, the legal confirmation that working-class mothers who couldn't afford proper representation were destined to lose children, to families with better lawyers, bigger houses, and trust funds that could provide security that love alone couldn't guarantee. But then Sandra Martinez stood up. She didn't raise her voice or adjust her second-hand blazer or perform any of the theatrical gestures that expensive attorneys use to command attention. She simply reached for the binder that had been sitting quietly on our defendant's table for the entire morning, its plain cover hiding evidence that would transform assumptions into accusations, confidence into horror. "Your Honor," Sandra said, her voice steady as bedrock, "I'd like to present evidence that fundamentally challenges everything opposing counsel has claimed about my client's fitness as a mother, and reveals information about Mr. Wilson's priorities that I believe will be relevant to this court's custody determination." The first page projected onto the courtroom screen was a bank statement showing Richard's account activity for the previous 6 months. $43,000 in cash withdrawals, each one corresponding exactly with dates when he'd told me he was attending business conferences that required overnight stays in Atlantic City. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet that had greeted Chen's presentation. This was the profound stillness that comes when assumptions get challenged by documentation that can't be argued with, dismissed, or explained away through expensive legal maneuvering. The second page was a casino ledger obtained through public records requests, showing systematic gambling losses that coincided perfectly with Danny's medical appointments that Richard had missed while losing money that could have paid for his son's asthma treatments for years. Margaret Chen's confident expression began to crack like paint under pressure. Her Armani suit suddenly looked less like armor and more like costume worn by someone who'd walked into the wrong courtroom expecting to perform in a different play. But Sandra was just getting started. The third page was a police report from 14 months ago, documenting an incident at the Mohegan Sun Casino where Richard had been questioned about his behavior after hotel staff reported erratic conduct in rooms adjacent to families with small children. The charges had been dropped after the Wilson family attorney had negotiated what the report diplomatically termed a private resolution. Richard's father's arms uncrossed with mechanical precision. His premature triumph was evaporating like morning fog under sunshine that revealed landscape he hadn't expected to see. The fourth page was a hospital record showing Danny's emergency room visit during a weekend when he'd been staying with his father. Severe asthma attack, admitted at 2:17 a.m., father unavailable for 3 hours because he was unreachable at what the social worker's notes described as a private social gathering. Richard's mother's pearl necklace no longer caught the light because she was staring down at her hands, probably calculating how many family secrets were about to be projected onto courtroom screens for public consumption. But the document that really changed the atmosphere in that room was page 7, an affidavit from Maria Santos, the babysitter who'd been paid $12,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement about what she'd witnessed during Danny's weekend visits to his father's house. Her testimony, now freed from legal constraints that had kept her silent, detailed neglect that went beyond missed medical appointments or unexplained absences. She described a 7-year-old boy left alone for hours while his father pursued activities that didn't include parental supervision, a child who'd learned to manage his own asthma inhaler because adults weren't consistently available during attacks that could be life-threatening. The gallery that had come to witness my defeat was now watching the systematic destruction of everything they'd assumed about who deserved custody and why. Whispered conversations had been replaced by the kind of uncomfortable silence that comes when comfortable assumptions meet uncomfortable truths. Judge Patricia Hernandez, who'd presided over family court for 18 years, leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd just realized that this case was going to be different from the routine custody transfer she'd expected to oversee. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying judicial authority that had shifted decisively away from assumptions about stability and toward questions about what stability actually meant when money couldn't buy responsible parenting. The woman who'd been dismissed as too broke to matter had just demonstrated that some evidence is more valuable than trust funds, some documentation more powerful than expensive attorneys, and some truths more compelling than any assumption about what poverty means in rooms where justice gets decided. Richard's smirk had disappeared entirely, replaced by the pale recognition that the mother he'd tried to erase had just proven she'd been paying attention to everything he'd thought she was too poor, too tired, or too defeated to notice. The courtroom showdown was just beginning, but the ammunition had already changed hands. The first slide projected onto that courtroom screen hit like a sledgehammer to glass. Offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, opened 18 months ago and drained to zero over the course of 6 months. Each withdrawal documented with Swiss precision, showing exactly how Richard had been moving money that should have gone to Danny's medical expenses into gambling accounts that had no connection to child support or parental responsibility. The numbers were staggering. $87,000 diverted from accounts that were supposed to be designated for Danny's future, his education, his healthcare needs that included specialized asthma treatments that insurance companies considered elective despite being necessary for a 7-year-old boy to breathe normally. But it was the second slide that really started the earthquake. Vegas gambling receipts, each one stamped with dates and times that corresponded exactly with Danny's scheduled medical appointments. Tens of thousands in losses at poker tables and slot machines, while his son sat in emergency rooms during asthma attacks, being treated by hospital staff who'd learned to expect that the boy's father would be unavailable for contact during medical emergencies. The Bellagio, the Venetian, Caesar's Palace. Each casino receipt was a monument to priorities that placed personal entertainment above parental responsibility, each loss documented in the kind of detail that comes when governments track financial transactions that cross state lines for tax purposes. Margaret Chen's confident posture began to crumble like a building whose foundation had just been revealed as sand rather than bedrock. Her Harvard Law confidence was evaporating in real time as she realized that her entire case strategy had been built on assumptions about my poverty rather than investigations into her client's actual character. But the third slide was the one that destroyed everything. A police report dated 14 months ago, stamped and sealed by the Connecticut State Police, documenting Richard's arrest for driving under the influence with a child passenger. The report was clinical in its language but devastating in its implications. Suspect was traveling eastbound on I-95 at approximately 11:47 p.m. when stopped for erratic driving. Blood alcohol content measured 0.12, well above legal limit. Minor child, age 6, discovered sleeping in rear passenger seat with no booster seat or proper restraints. The gasps that filled that courtroom weren't the polite murmurs of people processing mildly surprising information. They were the sharp intakes of breath that come when fundamental assumptions about reality get shattered by evidence that can't be explained away or rationalized through expensive legal maneuvering. Richard's confident face collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. The smirk that had carried him through months of legal proceedings disappeared, replaced by the pale recognition that secrets purchased with family money don't stay secret forever. When someone with nothing to lose starts asking the right questions to the right people. His mother clutched her pearl necklace so tightly that the strand snapped, sending beads scattering across the courtroom's marble floor like dice thrown by someone who'd just realized they'd been gambling with stakes they couldn't afford to lose. The sound of pearls hitting tile echoed through that suddenly quiet room like gunshots announcing the death of carefully constructed family mythology. Judge Patricia Hernandez leaned forward with eyebrows raised, her expression shifting from routine custody arbitration to criminal investigation territory. Counselor Martinez, is this documentation accurate? Sandra nodded with the gravity of someone presenting evidence that would rewrite the official record of who deserved what kind of custody arrangement. Yes, Your Honor. All documents have been verified through official channels and cross-referenced with hospital records showing the minor child's emergency room visits during periods when his father was engaged in the activities documented in these reports. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel, more decisive than any judicial ruling. It was the profound quiet that comes when truth meets lies in a forum where truth has legal backing and lies have only money to defend them. The gallery erupted in whispered conversations that sounded like the buzzing of wasps disturbed from their nest. Family friends who'd come to witness what they'd expected to be Richard's victory over his ex-wife were now trying to process evidence that the man they'd supported was the kind of father who gambled away his son's medical fund while driving drunk with the child unsecured in his back seat. Reporters in the back rows scribbled furiously, their pens moving across notebooks like seismographs, recording an earthquake that would send shockwaves through Hartford's social circles, where the Wilson family had been considered pillars of responsible wealth and community leadership. But it was Margaret Chen's reaction that really captured the magnitude of what was happening in that courtroom. Sweat had begun to soak through her expensive blouse, creating dark patches that announced stress in a profession where maintaining composure under pressure was supposed to be basic competency. Her carefully styled hair was losing its structure, and her hands trembled as she fumbled through legal documents that had suddenly become irrelevant to proceedings that were no longer about financial stability. Your Honor, she stammered, her voice cracking like ice under pressure. We weren't made aware of these allegations during discovery. I need to request a brief recess to consult with my client about. But Judge Hernandez was already shaking her head with the expression of someone who'd seen enough evidence to understand that this case had moved far beyond routine custody mediation into territory that might require involvement from Child Protective Services. Counselor Chen, are you suggesting that your law firm failed to conduct due diligence regarding your client's criminal record and financial behavior during the period in question? The question hung in that courtroom air like smoke from expensive cigars. But this time, the smoke was clearing to reveal truths that money couldn't buy, silence, or erase through strategic donations to police benevolent associations. Richard's father sat frozen in his chair like someone who'd just watched his family's reputation evaporate in real time. The crossed arms that had signaled premature triumph were now wrapped around his torso in what looked more like self-protection than confidence. Behind them, the gallery of supporters who'd come to witness my defeat were now whispering among themselves with the kind of energy that comes when people realize they're going to have very different conversations at their country club dinners than they'd planned when they'd arrived at court that morning. The woman they'd dismissed as too poor to deserve custody had just proven that poverty and parental fitness weren't the same currency, that wealth and responsibility weren't automatically connected, and that sometimes the people with the least money are the ones who understand most clearly what children actually need to survive and thrive. The evidence that had shattered their lies was still projected on that courtroom screen, each document a nail in the coffin of assumptions about what made someone worthy of raising a 7-year-old boy whose medical needs required more than trust fund checks to address properly. The mother they'd tried to erase had just reminded everyone in that room that you can't erase someone who's been keeping receipts. Judge Patricia Hernandez had seen enough. Her gavel remained untouched on the bench as she delivered words that would reshape everything about custody, wealth, and what it really means to be a fit parent in America. After reviewing all evidence presented, she said, her voice carrying across that marble-lined courtroom with the authority of someone who'd spent 18 years distinguishing between what people claimed and what they actually did. This court finds that the minor child's best interests are served by awarding full custody to his mother, Hazel Wilson. The silence that followed was so profound that I could hear the heating system humming through courthouse walls, the distant sound of traffic on streets where normal people were living normal lives that didn't require judges to determine who deserved to raise their own children. Furthermore, Judge Hernandez continued, her eyes moving between Richard and his family with the kind of judicial disapproval usually reserved for repeat offenders. The evidence demonstrates a pattern of behavior that renders the father unfit for unsupervised visitation. This court will not entrust a child's welfare to someone whose priorities have consistently placed personal gratification above parental responsibility. Richard's face had drained of color until it matched the marble floors that his family's money had probably helped pay for through strategic donations to courthouse renovation funds. His confident smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow recognition that money couldn't buy what he'd just lost through his own documented negligence. But it was his mother's reaction that really captured the magnitude of this moment. The woman who'd whispered loudly about how the boy belonged with them now sat frozen in her chair like someone who'd just watched her entire understanding of power, privilege, and entitlement crumble into dust that no amount of family wealth could reassemble. Her broken pearl necklace lay scattered across the floor like evidence of assumptions that had been shattered along with the expensive jewelry. Each bead reflected the courtroom lights like tiny mirrors showing fragments of a worldview where money was supposed to guarantee outcomes, where social position was supposed to translate into legal victories, where working-class mothers were supposed to accept defeat rather than fight back with documentation. I looked across that room at the family who'd mocked me, dismissed me, and tried to erase me from my own son's life, but I didn't gloat, didn't smile with vindication or deliver speeches about justice finally being served. Instead, I turned to Danny, who'd been sitting quietly beside me through proceedings that would determine the shape of his childhood, and squeezed his small hand. "We're going home," I whispered, loud enough for him to hear but quiet enough to respect the gravity of what had just happened in that courtroom. His 7-year-old smile was worth more than all the trust funds in Connecticut, brighter than all the pearls scattered across marble floors, more valuable than any victory that could be purchased with family lawyers and strategic donations to police benevolent associations. The arrogance that had filled that room like expensive cologne when we'd arrived was gone, replaced by the kind of uncomfortable silence that comes when people realize they've been fundamentally wrong about everything they'd assumed mattered in family court. No one from Richard's side dared to meet my eyes. The gallery of supporters who'd come to witness what they'd expected to be my defeat now studied their hands, their phones, their expensive shoes, anywhere except the face of the woman who'd just proven that poverty and parental fitness weren't the same equation, that wealth and character weren't automatically connected, that sometimes the people with the least money are the ones who understand most clearly what children actually need. The courtroom that had once been filled with laughter at my expense now bowed to truths that couldn't be purchased, silenced, or explained away through expensive legal maneuvering. The mother they'd tried to dismiss as too broke to matter had just been validated by evidence that was more compelling than any assumption about what stability meant. As I stood to leave, gathering the legal documents that would make Danny's custody official, I could hear the whispered conversations starting behind us. The kind of urgent, embarrassed discussions that happen when people realize they've just witnessed their assumptions about class, money, and parental fitness get systematically destroyed by someone they'd underestimated. The walk through those courthouse corridors felt different than it had 8 months ago when this legal battle had begun. Then, I'd been the woman fighting against odds that seemed insurmountable, carrying evidence that might not be believed by judges who typically sided with financial stability over maternal devotion. Now, I was walking through marble hallways with my son's laughter echoing off walls that had just witnessed justice triumph over assumptions, love prove stronger than trust funds, and truth defeat lies that had been protected by non-disclosure agreements and strategic legal donations. Reporters' cameras flashed behind us like strobe lights announcing the end of one story and the beginning of another. The headlines would write themselves, "Working Mother Defeats Wealthy Family, in Custody Battle, Evidence Trumps, Money in Hartford Family Court, Judge Rules Love More Important Than Trust Fund." But the real story wasn't about courtroom drama or legal victories. The real story was about a 7-year-old boy who would grow up in a home where his medical needs wouldn't be secondary to casino trips, where his mother's attention wouldn't be divided between parenting and gambling debts, where love would be measured by presence rather than checks written from accounts funded by other people's labor. The courthouse doors swung open like gates to a future that I'd fought 8 months to secure. Sunlight spilled across Danny's face as he looked up at me with eyes that held trust, instead of the confusion that had marked too many conversations about why Daddy missed soccer games and medical appointments. "Mom, does this mean I don't have to sleep at the big house anymore?" he asked, his 7-year-old voice carrying questions about custody arrangements that no child should have to navigate. "This means you sleep where you belong," I said, pulling him close as we walked down courthouse steps that felt like victory stairs rather than the mountain they'd seemed when we'd climbed them that morning. "With someone who puts you first every single day?" The world outside buzzed with the normal noise of a city that didn't know or care about custody battles, family court decisions, or the difference between inherited wealth and earned love. Traffic moved through Hartford streets with the same patterns it had followed before Danny's future had been decided by evidence rather than assumptions. But for us, walking toward a car that had seen better decades, but had always been reliable enough to get us where we needed to go, the noise felt different. Not overwhelming or threatening, but like the soundtrack to freedom from people who'd tried to purchase a child's future with money that couldn't buy the most important things he actually needed. They'd thought money was custody. But custody isn't wealth purchased with trust funds or influence bought with strategic donations. Custody is love demonstrated through presence, trust earned through consistency, and proof of who truly cares when caring requires sacrifice rather than check writing. And love was the only verdict that had ever mattered. If Hazel's story reminded you that being underestimated by wealthy people doesn't mean you're powerless against them, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Which moment in her custody battle hit you the hardest? Maybe you're fighting your own legal battle against people with better lawyers and bigger bank accounts. Maybe you've been told your struggles disqualify you from what you've earned through love and sacrifice. Maybe you know a mother who needs to hear that documentation beats intimidation every single time. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week, we're diving into another story about quiet preparation creating explosive justice. We're exploring the employee whose startup idea was stolen by her CEO, and how she used insider knowledge to destroy his company entirely. Share this video with someone who's been dismissed by people who mistake money for character. Drop a comment telling me about a time you proved that wealth doesn't equal worth, or when you witness someone's quiet strength defeat loud privilege. Your story might inspire our next video. Remember, they can outspend you on lawyers, intimidate you with their connections, tell you that poverty disqualifies you from keeping what you've earned through love, but they can't erase evidence, silence truth, or buy the kind of dedication that comes from actually caring. Sometimes justice isn't about having the most money, it's about having the most receipts. Until next time, keep documenting everything, because the people who underestimate you are usually the ones hiding the most evidence of why they don't deserve what they're trying to take. The mother they tried to erase just proved that love backed by evidence is stronger than wealth backed by lies. Now it's your turn to show them what they missed when they counted you out.